Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's distinguished lecture series by Scottish Centre for Korean Studies at the University of Edinburgh. My name is Youngmi Kim, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and I will chair today's lecture. I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Todd Henry. Professor Todd Henry is Associate Professor at the University of California, San Diego. He's specialist of modern Korea with a focus on the period of Japanese rule and its post-colonial afterlives. A special and cultural historian interested in lower forces that introduced lived spaces. Professor Henry also studies cross-border processes linking South Korea, North Korea, Japan, and the US in the creation of hot war militarism that trans-Pacific practice of medical sciences and the embodied experiences of hetero-patriarchal capitalism. Dr. Henry's first book, Assimilating Seoul, University of California Press, published in 2014 and translated in 2020, which won a 2020 Sejong Book Prize in History, Geography, and Tourism, addressed the violent but contested role of public spaces in colonial Korea. He co-produced documentary that I've been talking about that center understudied queer dimensions of authoritarian development in Cold War South Korea. These interdisciplinary projects explore the ideological functions and subcultural dynamics of non-normative sexuality and gender variance in connection to middle-brow journalism and urban entertainment, anti-communist modes of citizenship, and hetero-patriarchal labor, in addition to bodily autonomy and personal health in the context of the global sexual revolution, gender confirmation, and intersex struggles and ongoing stigma against HIV and AIDS. A piece of this research appears in his edited volume, Queer Korea, that he will talk about today as well. At UCSD, he's an affiliate faculty member of Critical Gender Studies and Science Studies from 2013 to 2018. Dr. Henry served as the inaugural director of Transnational Korean Studies, the recipient of $600,000 grant from the Academy of Korean Studies as a core university program for Korean Studies. Todd, welcome again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really good to see everybody. I wish we could meet in person. I've never been to Edinburgh, so maybe someday I can visit you and we can meet again in person.
Of course.
I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank Sang-pil and Professor Kim for inviting me and everybody who prepared the lecture. I'm going to share a little bit of the book that I edited last year, 2020, Queer Korea. And tell you a little bit about the creation of that project and some of its goals, and tell you a little bit about my own research in that book as a way of introducing you to this very important subject. And I think for me at least, there's a certain kind of sadness in giving this presentation, because in the last month alone, 3 transgender people committed suicide. For various reasons. These were people who were involved in LGBTQ activism. One was a school teacher and wanted to become a politician. Another one had been dismissed from the military because she transitioned while in the military. And so, yeah, I want to sort of take time to remember their amazing contributions to South Korean society and dedicate my presentation to them and to other people who are struggling just to survive in South Korea today. So I'm hoping that the book, which is also being translated and should be released in a couple of months, will have some kind of impact on making South Korea more livable place for LGBT people. For me, the project is quite personal. This is a picture you can see of me when I still had hair on my head. I first came to Korea in the late 1990s, at the very beginning of LGBT activism. And I participated in a student group at Seoul National University. It was called MAUM, one of the first student groups that emerged after authoritarianism ended in the late 1990s and democracy took over. So you can see that me there, both participating in, this is one of the early LGBT pride festivals that took place in Seoul. And for a while, I worked at a gay bar in Itaewon. And I love that this family used to come to the bar, not during business hours, but before we opened. And so you can see them visiting our bar there in the early 2000s. As someone who was trained in history, I worked with the activist community, and I could tell that they were incredibly busy just taking care of making South Korea a more livable place in the present and into the future. But as someone who is trained in history, I wanted to spend my time trying to document the history that became before the activist movement, which I said began in the late 1990s. So this is an image you will see from about 10, 12 years later, from 2013. I was actually on sabbatical at the time. This is when I began my Queer Korea project. And you can see a picture of the famous gay filmmaker Kim Jo-kwang-soo, who in 2013 had a public wedding ceremony in a quite well-known place in downtown Seoul along Cheonggyecheon, which is usually populated by heterosexual couples holding hands and enjoying themselves outside. Kim Jo-kwang-soo occupied that space momentarily to marry his longtime partner Kim Seung-hwan amid quite a lot of fanfare. There were a lot of supporters out, and as you can see, there were some detractors as well who tried to take over the ceremony and actually hurled human feces onto the stage in protest. So it was quite a spectacle at the time. And what was interesting for me as someone who was studying history is what I saw around that time, which was this headline in 2013 saying that this was the first same-sex wedding. In fact, that struck me as quite odd because at that time I was beginning to dig into archives from the 60s and 70s, and I found some very similar kind of message. This is a weekly publication from 1970 that says exactly the same thing. This is South Korea's first same-sex wedding ceremony. Of course, the images on the two pictures are quite different. These are actually two women getting married. These are, of course, two men in 2013. Both of the men dressed in some kind of ceremonial suits, but the same, whereas in this image, there's one female partner dressed in a Western style suit and another woman dressed in a hanbok. So I'm going to revisit this history in a little bit after I introduce the volume, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how personally I got started in doing my own research and eventually also editing a volume. Going back to some of the motivations for the volume, when I first came to South Korea, I often heard this statement that there are no gay people in Korea. And at first that struck me as kind of ridiculous But I also realized that this was a deeply seated myth of conservatism that not only had seeped into South Korean popular attitudes, but had also seeped into my own field of Korean studies. I could find almost no studies that addressed issues of same-sex sexuality and gender variance in history. And so I could tell that this needed some kind of academic treatment. It also manifested in the fact that there are still very few classes in Korea that specialize in this kind of field of study, even though there's an increasing number of graduate students and younger people who are interested in the topic. It's infrequently taught at universities, and in terms of having a career, it's very difficult. Even today, graduate advisors often steer their students away from studying these topics because they are seen as taboo and because students would probably still have difficulty getting a job if they wrote a PhD thesis in this area. And yet at the same time, I mentioned there's a growing community of students who are interested in these topics and for whom books on queer Korea are incredibly important. So I wanted to try to understand where this myth, I call the no gay myth, came from, and how it's has emerged both in popular political campaigns like the ones you see here, where very conservative Christians have been using pride festivals to counteract against the growing visibility of LGBT activists. So this is the table of contents of the book. And I would describe the approaches taken in the book as comprising three different kinds of approaches. The first one I'll explain is minoritizing. The second one is universalizing, and the third one is provincializing. So as you can see, the book is divided into two parts. The first part deals with the first half of the 20th century when Korea was colonized by Japan, so the colonial period, and the period into the early post-colonial period through the Park Chung-hee period. And then the last chapter deals with some of the more recent issues of post-authoritarian times from the 90s and into the early 21st century, excuse me. So in terms of minoritizing approaches, various chapters in the book deal with unknown subcultures of same-sex sexuality, of gender variance in such areas, for example, as popular religion. So there's a piece early in the book about shamanism. There's several pieces about schoolgirl cultures, especially as they took place in schools, including an essay that was translated from Korean into English that deals with wartime literature and how representations of female same-sex love, even during a very repressive period during the 30s and the 40s, managed to appear in literature from that period. And then there's other pieces that deal with, for example, the history of cross-dressing in popular films from the 1960s, a period that we tend to think of as also being repressive under the Park Chung-hee period. The piece I'll talk about in a minute about the history of same-sex weddings from the 60s and 70s, as well as other subcultures that are largely unknown. For example, the history of men who serve in the military and who try to navigate the kinds of toxic forms of masculinity that they might find in the military. So the book, in this sense, deals with largely unknown subcultures, and I call that view minoritizing because it tends to treat them as let's say, a small group of people or a marginalized group of people within a larger mainstream. The second approach I would call universalizing, in the sense that it doesn't simply treat small number of marginalized communities, but instead uses same-sex sexuality, gender variance, and other forms of queerness as a way of shedding light on different kinds of regimes of normativity as they developed in and around capitalism, in and around militarism, and also questions of family. And these are, in fact, issues that have very much interested people in my field, whether they've studied the development and transformation of agrarian society, whether they've dealt with issues around industrialization, whether they've treated the mobilization of Korean men in the military in the 30s and 40s, or the militarism of the 60s and 70s. Issues around family have been very much a part of social history. So the book tries to show how studying issues of queerness should accompany those kinds of views of social and cultural history. And also how they've been consistently ignored or thought away, as earlier I suggested, in terms of the idea of the no gays myth. And the last thing the book tries to do is to provincialize. And this is more dealing with the field, the larger field of Asian queer studies, which is developed in the last couple of decades, and has tried to use the instance of China or Japan or Southeast Asia as a way of producing knowledge about queerness that is not anchored in the experience of North America and Western Europe, which has largely been the basis for much theorizing in queer studies. So the book also tries to use Korea as a kind of laboratory and to think about how the histories of colonialism or the histories of military occupation under the US or national division are not only sort of particular histories or singular histories that we should talk about in terms of Korean studies, but how a place like Korea, colonized or post-colonized, or even, for example, thinking about Korea in its relationship to Southeast Asia as a kind of sub-empire within the US empire post-1945, can be used as a way to further enhance critiques that are going on in the field of queer studies. So that's kind of an overview of what the book does. If you're interested, you can purchase the book. You can also look at it online as well. So what I'd like to do in the rest of the talk is to give you a little bit of more detail about my own contribution to the volume, and to talk about it in terms of my ongoing research of South Korean history during the 60s and the 70s, and to talk about how we can use little known archives and still not fully exploited archives from the mass media in order to try to write queer histories of Korea. And in doing so, both talk about the history, the subcultural history of homoeroticism. So this would be, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of minoritized history that we know little about. So for example, the same-sex weddings that I'll introduce, but also through those histories, how we can understand better the history of how patriarchy operated, and in particular, how heterosexual versions of patriarchy operated in the promotion of things like capitalism and militarism and other kinds of systems of power that relied on certain kinds of social and cultural institutions. So this would be more of the kind of universalizing approach that I mentioned earlier. So I'd just like to make a few points in the rest of the lecture, and I'll kind of list them out here, and then I'll go through some of the archives so you can see some of the kinds of materials that I've been looking for. So to return to those two images that I put up earlier about same-sex marriage, you know, for the first time, these two men were marrying in 2013 versus the archive I showed you from 1970. These were obviously not the same thing. They were quite different, and they were not the first. In fact, as I'll show you, 1970 wasn't the first time that people in Korea were getting married, either unofficially, not legally necessarily, but symbolically, going to churches or going to Buddhist temples and asking people there to wed them. And so I want to try to think about what the meaning of these practices might have meant, as well as what effect or what sort of work the media was doing by consistently reminding readers that this was somehow the first time that this practice was happening. So the difference, of course, is that in 2013, the same-sex marriage was attempting to legalize the union between Kim Jo-kwang-soo and Kim Seung-hwan. And we also saw that the couple was presented as a kind of gender normative couple, especially by men in the mass media, whereas the materials that I'm going to show you today were largely ceremonies that didn't aim for the legalized arrangement, because they understood that the authoritarian state in the 60s and 70s would never sanction that kind of arrangement, but nonetheless decided to get married anyway, symbolically. And most of the examples I found are women who got married, and got married not in gender normative pairs, but got married as sort of dyads. The subcultural term that was used among women was chimashi and pajishi, so Mrs. Skirt and Mrs. Pants. The mass media often captured them as quote unquote husbands and wives, trying to fit them into the heteromarital practices of South Korea. So there were, of course, historical precedents to both of these cases. There were cases before 2013, and there were cases before 1970. So I want us to try to think about what the media was making us misremember or forget when they were arguing that this was somehow a first. So despite historical differences, there was something queer happening, I argue, well before South Korea's transition to democracy in the 1990s, and before the so-called economic miracle. So the presentation asks what that might have been. What I argue or try to show in the paper is that one of the reasons why this particular issue was covered so much was because of certain male anxieties about the disruption of kinship practices, heterosexual or normative kinship practices that took place after the Korean War. So some of the early accounts that I will show you are directly in response to that national tragedy. Partly the fact that many men died in that war, many women were left widowed and left single, and so had to somehow find a way to manage on their own. And one of the sort of little known things about this kind of queer aftermath of the war was that some of these women actually partnered or remarried, but did so with other women. And then I'll show you in the second section the male anxieties that lead to the repeated representation of these kinds of arrangements, I think had to do with fears about the sexual revolution. So here is an area where we can see Korea's transnational connections to the sexual revolution, or the imagined sexual revolution, as it's taking place in places like the United States, the UK, parts of the West, where the sexual revolution is imagined to be now arriving on Korea's shores. And so part of the discourse became, homosexuality, women partnering with one another, these kinds of deviations from heterosexuality and from normative kinship practices that I think help explain why they appear so readily in the archives. What I also tried to show is that the media were quite important in providing a way to accommodate these kinds of non-normative practices. This is why the mass media often used husbands and wives as a comprehensible way to try to make sense of women who were marrying one another. So they often use this word eccentric or esec to describe these kinds of different forms of marriages. And I try to think about in whose interest do these stories serve for readers. So I'll show you in a minute the various weekly publications, which were largely aimed at lower class and middle class men as consumers. So we have to think about how female same-sex practices or homoeroticism would have been consumed by men at that time. Of course, some women were also readers, but the primary audience were working men. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The subcultural context I've already explained of war widows and single mothers after the war. And after the 1960s, the context of female migration from countryside to cities and the emergence of women into working class positions, working as public laborers, were, I think, some of the contexts that help explain why these stories got so much attention at this time. And I should mention earlier that when I began this project, many people thought that I would never be able to sort of write this kind of history because they imagined that there would be no archives. And in fact, I'll show you in a minute that there's plenty of materials to use. And so that's one of the things I'd like to show you. So same-sex coupling may or may not have had anything to do with same-sex desire. In fact, it might have been simply for the purposes of stabilizing one's economic wherewithal while using the socially acceptable form of marriage as a socially dignifying practice. So it would have been extremely difficult, especially for women, to remain unmarried at this time. And so same-sex coupling and marriages were one way in which to gain some kind of dignity and social recognition, as well as economically stabilize their relationship. And it also might have provided, outlet for same-sex desires, but that's not the only issue at play. So this is, I think, a good example of how we should think of queerness always in relationship to social and economic history. And the other remarkable thing I found, especially these days in the ongoing debates about whether South Korea will legalize same-sex marriage, is that there was, it appears, some kind of religious and familial recognition for these kinds of arrangements. So I mentioned Buddhist temples, and I will show you some images that portray groups of friends and even family members who have recognized and sanctioned these kinds of same-sex arrangements. So, going against the idea that queerness is somehow imported from the outside or it's new to Korea, the research that I'm doing tries to dispel these kinds of myths. And ultimately, what I'd like to try to do is to think about how South Korea's past, the past I'm talking to you about, how that might help us as we proceed today to empower, to give meaning, and for LGBT people in Korea to pursue happiness. So let me quickly go through the rest of the slides and show you some of the things that I found from the archive. These are some of the accounts from the early post-Korean War period, they tend to predictably talk about same-sex sexuality as some kind of criminality or some kind of sexual deviance. This is also the time in South Korean history when ideas about deviance as described through psychiatry were gaining greater credence as the US military and the occupation also brought with it medical knowledge, and as Korean doctors were also increasingly studying overseas, they adapted Freudian and neo-Freudian understandings of homosexuality as a way to somehow try to shore up patriarchy in the context of this war that had completely shaken up the foundations of Korean patriarchy and family life. In fact, discussions about same-sex intimacy and even the practice of wedding ceremonies appear as early, almost as the war is closing. So this is one of the first accounts I found from 1957 from a monthly magazine that talked about a same-sex couple. They didn't describe them as having a wedding ceremony here, but they went to take a ceremonial picture. And so this is just one of the examples that we can use to try to chronicle this much longer history. Here's another example you can see from a publication from around the same time from 1958. You can see the way in which this language of perversity has entered the discourse. So kihyung, this is like some kind of abnormality, like if you have an abnormal child, this would have been used, like for example, to describe a child with Down syndrome. But here abnormality is being used to describe female couples who were partnering with one another and who you could see described in these kinds of articles. This is one of the terms that I want to point out that was frequently used in the mass media at the time, mettor bubu. This seems to be a word that gained popularity around this time, but harken back to a much earlier period in Korean history. This is from the Joseon dynasty, when palace women who would have served the king, who were concubines serving at the court, would have lived in the same quarters. And these women, when not serving the king, might have engaged in their own forms of intimacies. And so mettor, literally millstone, this was a kind of metaphor that was used in a very male-centric and voyeuristic archive to describe the kind of rubbing of female genitalia. And so you can see how this kind of understanding of sort of abnormal psychology is entering the media at the very time that these kinds of women are entering the mass media as a kind of object for male voyeurism. And you can see early on the connection to war widows and the relationship to the war from the late 1950s into the early 1960s. This is just another example I provide you to show you how this is not just limited to like one particular place, but is actually a national phenomena. This is an example I found from a newspaper article from the Busan Ilbo that talks about a pairing of a couple that had been dating for 10 years. So this would have gone back actually into the early years of the Korean War. And you can see them here walking in a park. And again, this kind of dyadic pairing of one individual dressed in pants. So this would have been subculturally known as pajishi, and chimashi, the female partner dressed here in hanbok. This kind of pairing often appears in newspaper articles in connection to various forms of social deviance, including criminality. So I've already mention the kinds of subcultures that developed after the Korean War, partly as a way of surviving, but also as a way of uh, women meeting one another for various kinds of intimacies. They were often described in the media not as pajishi and chimashi, the subcultural terms, but instead as husbands and wives in an attempt to try to understand them within the heteronormative terms of South Korean society at the time. But as you see marked here with these various question marks, which I put in red, even though the word husbands and wives are often used, there's constant doubt that is cast on these figures by the frequent use of these question marks, whether two women can actually kind of have a partnership or have a long-lasting partnership or a meaningful partnership. And in fact, their relationships were often undercut and criticized as being deviant and criminal, particularly with the figure of the pajishi, the person that would have been here on the left, likened to some kind of pro-communist infiltrator. So here we can see a clear way in which the female same-sex relationships were also figured by the Korean War in terms of some kind of suspicions of North Korean subversion. And it was really the masculine partner in the pair that was given the most attention. So this is an example of the kind of attention that was given to the pajishi. And this particular individual was described as having dressed as a man for 28 years and had passed in a sort of male-dominated profession. For example, working at a factory at a time when labor protests, particularly among working class men in the 1960s, were growing. And so female masculinity here was also sort of closely connected to working class agitation and was consistently described as some kind of danger to be on the watch for. So whether it was a kind of danger that was associated with working class masculinity, or there was a danger as a kind of North Korean infiltrator, this is a very frequent kind of image that was captured by the mass media, and often captured in the context of some kind of police capture. So this is a really good example of how medicine, policing, and mass media are working together to sort of capture and to try to accommodate these kind of non-normative sexual practices, and in the process to warn readers about their existence. This stands in contrast to other kinds of gender non-conforming figures. So I just put this here as a kind of counterexample. So if the female masculinity was presented as some kind of danger, as some kind of, from a male perspective, in a kind of occupation of male-dominated space by women, the counterexample of male-born people who are presenting themselves as women or passing as women or working in female-dominated professions like sex work were described by contrast as something kind of laughable. In fact, they could easily be made into a kind of stock figure in comedy films. So one of the chapters in Queer Korea deals with B-grade comedy films, and the audiences can quite literally kind of laugh at the male who takes on the figure of being a kisang. So this is a poster from the 1969 film, and also the figure emerges in popular media representations about the capture of, these are individuals who are working in and around military bases, providing sexual services to American soldiers, and who are captured, and who people can read about and sort of collectively laugh at. So I just wanted to show you one other source that I used. I've been using quite a lot in my research, and that is the weekly publication, which gains popularity in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As South Korea quickly became an industrialized and urbanized country, you needed to provide a certain kind of form of media entertainment. So we saw a film poster. Films were quite popular, and so were these weekly publications that were beginning in the late 60s and 70s, were about 30 pages long. The stories were quite short. The stories were easy to read. They were quite sensational. And they included things like you can see here, Korea's first same-sex wedding. This is the image I put up earlier from 1970. You can see how the weeklies more or less converged with the period of dictatorship, particularly under Park Chung-hee during the 60s and 70s. By the early 1990s, the weeklies fade out as other kind of media gain popularity. But during the 60s and 70s, they were very profitable for, as you can see, most of the mainstream newspaper companies. So the 중앙일보, 경향일보, this is 한국일보, 서울신문, 한국일보, they all had their own forms of weeklies. And earlier I showed you, I talked to you about how these were quite male-centric. And so here you can see on the covers figures of women. These were also publications that had probably the closest you could get in the 60s and 70s to soft pornography in Korea. So there were pictures of women in swimsuits. So you can imagine the kind of various purposes to which these would have been put, particularly as men could not only buy these magazines and subscribe to them, but also find them in popular public places like train stations and barber shops, where they could be picked up, read, and then put down for someone else to read. In terms of thinking about why same-sex relationships were always described as being a first, I want you to try to think about the kind of temporality and circularity of the publications themselves. So it was a weekly, something you would pick up and then you would throw out, and then you would get a new weekly the next week. So if we think of consistently or repeatedly consuming stories of same-sex sexuality and literally disposing of the magazine, it reminds you of the kind of disposability of queer bodies as they were consumed by Koreans during this period of industrialization. So here I show you an example that in fact predated that earlier example I first put up from the 1970. In fact, this was created by the same journal, the 한국일보, and you can see the kinds of ways in which this kind of male-centric voyeurism took place. If you read these accounts, they're really interesting in terms of the way in which they combine both investigative journalism, but also storytelling, particularly thinking about how the reporters gained access to these couples and gained access to their wedding ceremonies. One of the things I'm still trying to find out is how, for example, the reporters had access to these kinds of pictures, wedding pictures, for example, whether the couples themselves provided them, or whether the journalists were kind of these paparazzis who took the pictures themselves. I'll quickly try to finish up because I know I've gone to about 40 minutes, but I'll just quickly go through the rest of the archives and the pictures and show them to you quickly. So here again is a kind of another example. This is clearly a wedding picture. This is a picture of a couple at home and then at work. So there's a lot of questions we could ask about in terms of the kind of imagery that circulates in the media. This is a really rare account. Usually same-sex sexuality during the authoritarian period, as I'm showing you, was produced from the outside in. So we have very few accounts of people who actually were involved in the marriages and talked about their lives from their own perspectives. This is a really rare account. I found kind of autobiographical account, speaking back to the kind of voyeurism that took place in the mass media. Here, a couple of images going back to the kind of subcultural context. You can see this wedding ceremony with someone presiding over the wedding. This is the chanchi, this is the reception after the wedding, and the kind of family members celebrating the wedding. It gives us some sign of the kind of social acceptability of these couples. This is actually the mother of one of the female couples, like going on some kind of outing with the female couple, and some of the images from the archive as well. Let me just quickly go through some of the other images. This looks like a Buddhist temple. This is a ceremony from 1974. And then the last one, a couple of the images I want to show you here are also the practices, I would call it, of queer kinship. So female couples either adopting the child, or at a time when family planning was going on in South Korea, South Korean families often had more children than they could raise. It was not uncommon for a neighbor to give up a child to a same-sex female couple to raise the child as part of this kind of queer family. And last image I just wanted to show you here that gives you a really clear example. This is from the 1980s. This is clearly a picture of a Buddhist temple. You can see a picture of the Buddha. And what I really like about this image is you can see this man in the back smiling. This is, again, is a same-sex couple. And you can see in the back here, it looks like all women. I can't tell if they're friends or family members, and you can see them here inside the temple celebrating the marriage. So I think without providing a conclusion, or let me just quickly provide a conclusion and just tell you that I gave you just one example of female homoeroticism in same-sex couples, which was, as you've seen from the archives, clearly an important topic of popular debate during the authoritarian period. And it's one of the many issues that I'm trying to use to restore both a kind of subcultural history to different kinds of queer groups, as well as to try to make sense of how queer history fits within the larger framework of South Korean economic development and authoritarian politics. So I will stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or other concerns you might have. Thank you for listening to a long talk.
Fascinating talk. I mean, that's amazing. You're going through historical media archives. You know, it's very difficult to find out all those data. I think we can start having questions from the floor. Anybody has a question? Sang-pil?
Could I go first? Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Henry. And I don't know yet to remember, but we did have you at SOAS when I was working there for one of your lectures. Yeah. So it's good to see you again. And you mentioned Joseon example, but I'm just wondering, perhaps one of the reasons why the homosexuality is really frowned upon may have to do with to a large extent Joseon legacy, because as a historian, I'm sure you're well aware that in Goryeo times we had records describing, for example, like people like Gong Min-wang, who is he was actually bisexual, but there was also Mokjong, who actually was apparently gay, and it was recorded historical materials, and so it seemed like maybe Korea's perception of homosexuality was not as conservative as we may think. Yeah, that's my question slash comment, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're quite right about that. I mean, definitely during the Joseon dynasty, there were few, of course, there's not this kind of mass media, but as far as I can tell from the archives that we have, it's quite difficult to find these kinds of practices. I mean, there are, of course, historical terms for same-sex intimacies like namsek, of course, that was known also, of course, in Imperial China and Japan as well, using that same kind of term, but tended to refer to the same-sex practices of an older elite man and a younger, often less elite boy as a kind of acolyte or some kind of follower. So it was a way, for example, for literati to show their status. And, you know, I think there was a certain kind of place for this in Joseon society. There's a really interesting article, if you care to know, that was researched by actually a high school history teacher who interviewed older men and found out that this practice of namsek continued well into the 1930s and the 1940s, where older men would announce that they were taking a kind of boy. The word that was used in Korean is midong, so 아름다운 동화, a beautiful boy. Sometimes this was also referred to as namchop, a male like concubine. So there were certainly certain areas within Joseon society where those kinds of practices were acceptable, but largely they were accepted as part of the status system rather than being sort of known as homosexuality. In fact, many of the midong would eventually get married. And of course, the yangban were also married. So I wouldn't necessarily refer to that as bisexual, but there was a certain kind of place within Joseon society for those kinds of practices. So I suppose we can best see that. For example, some of you may have seen 왕의 남자. What was the English title again? The King and the Clown? No.
Yes, King and Clown, yes.
King and the Clown, yeah. So a really short sort of passage from the Shillok was used as a kind of way to demonstrate that kind of relationship. In this case, between a king and someone who was from one of the despised classes. And then the tradition I mentioned earlier of court women who maybe just for purposes of being bored had some kind of romantic intimacies with one another or physical intimacies with one another. So it was interesting to me that later in the era when homosexuality in the modern era becomes a kind of popular idiom, that it was described for women as this mettor bubu, which is a kind of reference back to a Joseon dynasty practice, but within the context of describing these women as being kind of socially deviant, or because they didn't get married, or because they ran away from men. Often this could be read as a kind of critique of male violence in the 60s and 70s. And remarkably, the media sort of is, even though it's a male-centered media, it's often critical of men. And talks about sort of violent men is one of the reasons why women sort of run away from them or become involved with like USGIs. So I find the mass media is a really interesting space to both try to understand subculture, but also try to understand how these kinds of images were doing certain kind of teaching about relationships that people should have or shouldn't have, or I suppose even when the media was describing this practice in a kind of negative way or derogatory way, that there's also always the possibility that you have readers who can read against those messages. Like, I've done some interviews, and for example, gay men will tell me, you know, I say to them, ask them, how do you find out about where you would want to go to meet a male partner? And they always would say 주간지, because there's not a gay magazine or gay press. And so where do you find out messages and information? Well, you find them from these kinds of publications. So historians in Korea tend to downplay these publications because they say that they're like just rumor and scandal, and all the stories are made up and invented and you can't believe them. But they must have been really popular at that time, and people consumed them, and it did certain kind of image making. So I think it's worth trying to revisit them for that reason.
There's a question by Elisa. Elisa, would you like to ask a question directly? You can also have hands on the screen.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting presentation. We'll be honest, I'm not very familiar with your subject, but I learned a lot today, and I'm really interested to read your book. I was just wondering, because you mentioned looking at the colonial period in the Japanese imperialism, if you were able to find comparable data with the situation within the Japanese and the Chinese societies, and how they handle same sex weddings, and if it's different or if it's similar. Is it like more like a regional culture, would you say, or really specific to Korea?
Yeah,
By the way, Elisa is our MSc student.
That's a really good question. If you read Korean, there's a quite interesting book called, the title is very similar to Queer Korea. It's called Choson Queer, and it's actually all about the colonial period. And you will find actually, if you read that book, that many of the kinds of discourses that you find in South Korea in the 60s and 70s are similar. So there is a culture for women around schools, so schoolgirl love. There were many articles both in Japan and Korea, as well as in China in the 20s and the 30s, about schoolgirls who fell in love with each other. Sometimes they, in some instances, they committed suicide together and became sort of scandalous fodder for the mass media at the time, that sort of speculated on why these girls were committing suicide, or why they loved their girls' schools. So there's some interesting research in that book, as well as in modern Japanese history. They called them S onni. So S, I think, stood for sister relationships. So I see actually in the 60s and 70s that many of those discourses are actually continue on in a very similar vein from the colonial period. But what is interesting and what I think is new is the practice of wedding ceremonies and marriage, because I think I did find a few instances in the colonial period of that practice, but it was imagined that you could have a female same-sex romantic relationship, or even boys in boys' schools could have same-sex relationships, but as long as you sort of outgrew your homosexuality and you became married, that could be easily explained away as kind of experimentation. So there's quite a lot of pressure at the moment of, graduation, and at the moment of going from a teenager to a young adult. So the fact that women were opting out of marriage with men, or bearing children with men and cohabiting with women or marrying women, that was a considerable sort of violation of patriarchal norms. So that I find is quite new to South Korean discourse from the 60s and 70s, actually beginning after the Korean War. But the discourse on female same-sex relationships, particularly in schools or in other same-sex institutions, that was a continuation from the colonial period.
We have a question from Corina.
I don't know whether my video will come on. Wait a minute. Oh, it will. Okay. Hi.
Hi, Corina.
I'm a Chinese studies student, but I'm doing a Korean studies module this semester. I kind of was thinking about, whilst listening to your talk, conversations I've had with personal friends. And it was because you mentioned this kind of separation necessarily, or maybe the coexistence of queer identity, but also queer cohabitation more to do with circumstance, or it was economic circumstance, or it was because of loneliness, or it was because of being widowed during the war, these kind of things. And I thought about a more modern phenomenon of political lesbianism, which I think kind of exists in South Korea with the rise of the Me Too movement. And I had the kind of an interesting conversation with friends about that, because a lot of the women who are dating other women, or who even have committed relationships with other women, don't identify as being queer or being lesbians. For them, it's more of a political statement. It's about their own safety or their own happiness, and they feel safer and happier with women, but they don't necessarily identify as being queer. So I was wondering, is there a kind of about the intersection between more circumstantial queerness and the identity of queerness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I want to kind of problematize with the research. So I mentioned economy, for example. So you will find some representations of female masculinity, or the pajishi figure, for example, in the post-war period, also in the guise of a son. So if a family member lost their male heirs in the war, so if a woman lost a brother, it was not uncommon for a daughter to replace the brother in the family. So we might think of queerness as, we tend to think of queerness as escaping the family, right? Queerness opposes itself to the institution of marriage or the practices of patriarchal kinship. But in this case, a female-born person who takes over for her lost brother in the war, and who becomes the wage earner, and who presents as masculine, and who, let's say, goes out and works in the fields or works in the factory, and might also take a female partner, that's also a kind of queerness, but that queerness is not necessarily, as you suggest, only based on or primarily based on sexual identity. So I'm trying to find a way in the research to capture that kind of complexity. And I'm not even sure if queer is the right word, because sometimes in the interviews with the subjects themselves, I noticed there's a disconnect between the vocabulary I'm using and the vocabulary that they might have used. So one of the challenges is to not put too much kind of theoretical or conceptual or Western-centric language on the actual histories, and try to work. That's why I think the archive is really important, to work through the archive and try to figure out how at least those kinds of individuals were understood by Koreans who are writing about them, if not to understand the individuals themselves. And I found many examples actually of this phenomena of, it's often described as kind of the way the media is able to accommodate it is to talk about these kinds of quote unquote queer women as filial, as almost like they're filial sons. So to me, this is really interesting because there are also, as you mentioned, with women, let's say in contemporary China or contemporary South Korea, there's also versions of that with men. So I have a lot of gay friends who are around my age, so like in their 40s, and they've passed the age where their parents are determined to get them married because they're not of marriageable age. But now they've become like super filial sons because they're not married and have to have their own family. They can stay at home and take care of their parents. So they're gay and they're filial at the same time. So I think it's really interesting to think about these ways in which queerness sort of fits and doesn't fit within family or within economy or within expectations about labor. And I think that's the most interesting place where the Korea research can kind of speak back to maybe queer theories that assume the primacy of like identity, like queerness as identity, where this is kind of like queerness as part being embedded within a kind of deeper social fabric of families or sort of economic relationships or obligations to family, but could also include individual desires and senses of embodiment and other things as well. It's just hard to kind of sort out what's what at what time, at what period.
Yeah, thanks. That's really insightful.
Any question? I also have a question. Before the question, I think, have you ever searched 왕비 열전? Think, I'm not a historian, but I remember when I was young, people reading 왕비 열전, they were talking about, sexual minority in a history. So if you have not, gone through that, maybe you can think about it. In terms of question, yesterday I was reading Korean newspaper briefly, and there were, I may be wrong, but there was a minority party established for by-election. If you know anything about that movement just happening right now in Korea.
Say it again, there was a minority part.
They call it 성소수자 정당, something like that. So minority party they established for this by-election in April.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I do know that there have been two mayoral candidates, Seoul mayoral candidates, who have come out publicly supporting LGBT people. And there is a committee within the Justice Department, a Justice Party, 정의당,
Yeah,
dedicated to that issue. But as you know, it hasn't gained enough steam in any sort of comprehensive way to lead to, let's say, an anti-discrimination bill or a kind of political scenario like in a debate. You probably remember the current president when he was asked before he was elected, like, what are his views on LGBT? This is often like used by the super conservative party members in order to delegitimize any left of center politician. So I'm not sure how that's going to change in the political realm. I just hope that it doesn't, as I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't require people to self-harm and commit suicide in order for politicians to take seriously the fact that LGBT is a population in South Korea and a population that's prone to varying degrees, lack of support and poverty and being, thrown out of their company or their family for being gay or for being transgender or this kind of thing. So I hope it picks up in the political scene, but I'm not sure. Maybe people who are following politics will have a better response than I will.
All right, thank you. Tintin?
Yes. Thank you. I very much enjoyed your lecture. I always think it's interesting to look at the kind of historical aspects of queerness. So I'm a Korean studies major from Stockholm University, and I have a question regarding, you talked a little bit about terminology, and I think that's always really interesting, like the words people use to describe themselves. But I'm not sure, you might not be able to answer this question, but in Sweden, where I'm from, where there are certain queer study scholars, because we use the word queer in Sweden as well, and obviously it's a loan word from English, and it has, you know, certain connotations in English since it's a reclaimed word. And there are certain queer study scholars who argue, or at least in the past have argued, that we shouldn't use the word queer and we should have our own like native word. And I was wondering, in like the Korean context, what the kind of discourse surrounding terminology, if there is any discourse like this surrounding the terminology queer, and you know, if there are certain words we should use and shouldn't use, because I just think it's very interesting, since I'm not a native Korean speaker, I don't really know the context of certain words, and I was wondering if you could enlighten me a bit about that.
There is a word that was used sort of at the beginning of the LGBT rights movement called Iban. I'm not exact, people don't, I think, exactly know when it began, probably sometime in the late 80s, early 90s. And people also don't exactly know the meaning of it. Some people say that Iban is opposed to Ilban. So like Ilban is like someone who's normal. So Iban would be someone who's different. So that could be one sort of articulation of difference or queerness. If you connect it to human rights and political discourse, Iban could also be like a second-class citizen. So if you're trying to gain access to rights, you're saying that first-class citizens are straight people or cisgender people, and gay and lesbian people are also would be kind of second class. So some people have advocated for using Iban, but if you talk to like younger generation, they don't know what Iban is, because Iban is kind of from that earlier generation of activists and has sort of fallen out of usage. It is true that queer tends to have more of a kind of scholarly or academic hinge to it. So we could use other words, and we could use words that come out of the archive itself. So, but then they tend to be quite derogatory. So like gay men were referred to as homo, and transgender people were referred to as like male dressed women or female dressed men. And I also find that derogatory in the sense that ultimately, if you're what we would today say is trans woman, you're just a male-bodied person who dresses up like a woman. So that discourse denies people any kind of identification with I am a woman or I was born a woman. So I try to move away from that kind of term. And the best we have are these kind of more generic terms like gender nonconformity or queer. So I try to use them strategically, but then embed very specifically what I mean by queer. So like, as I mentioned, the person who's born a woman but who loses her brother and refashions herself in the guise of the breadwinning first son, I would call that queer, but I would specify exactly what I mean by that in that particular situation. And again, my biggest problem is if I could have a conversation with that person, they might not want me to use the word queer. So then how do I capture that? Well, I could say, like, you know, born a girl. I just have to describe it in a lot of kind of detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was actually very enlightening. So.
Thank you. Maybe we can start with Esti's question and then Elisa. Is that okay? Esti?
Thank you. For all of us that we are in Edinburgh, we really hope to see you soon here, as you say. It was absolutely wonderful. Sadly, with the suicide of the transgender military in the early March, I came across with the infamous article of the military criminal act, like actually punish same-sex and actually punish it for up to 2 years in prison. And I was really surprised to read it, like actually that was imported from the Americans on 50s or something like that. So I was wondering, like, also Korean society and Americans, they are completely in different levels of tolerance with homosexuality. But I was thinking, like, maybe, do you feel like maybe the difference might be only superficial? And I even thinking, not just thinking about Americans, I'm originally from Spain. And I always was thinking, like, our society is a little bit fake when it's related about homosexuality rights. For example, like in Spain, we were one of the first countries like legalize same-sex marriage, but later we could see like actually homophobic crime grow up amazingly. So yeah, I was thinking like, my question is like, how differences between other societies, like really, is that bad, South Korea towards other societies?
Yeah, the law, military penal code you're referring to, law 92.6, that's been one of the main goals of the LGBT legal movement, is to decriminalize that, because it's also quite vague, the law itself. You're right, it seems to have been brought in through the Americans, probably in the context of the Cold War and concerns about homosexuality as, you know, like somehow being pro-communist. It's not clear how much that law was actually used. So I know a lawyer who's been very active in trying to get rid of that law. And I asked her, because they have to go to the court and argue the legal case. And I asked her, I said, do you have any sense of how much actually that law was used historically? And we have very little documentation about that. My guess is that law was put on the books early on, as you said, in the 50s, at the early part of the Cold War, and was not used very much. We know that actually that same-sex, male-male sexual relations and sexual violence in the military is rampant. So there would have been a huge disincentive to use that law if it referred to higher ranking officers who would have, let's say, raped a conscript, because that would have incriminated that person as being violating this kind of law. So it seems not to have been put to use, except for rare cases where there's huge hierarchy between officer and recruit, where sexual violence and sexual taunting was the basis for creating order. It seems to be where the law was used is more equal relationships, let's say between conscripts who fall in love in the military. That seems to be the place where it was used, if it was used at all. And it seems to have gained prominence, in my mind, in fact, after Korea became democratic and after the LGBT rights movement got off the ground. And most recently, when the leadership of the army was clearly heavily Christian and was using gay apps and other kinds of GPS technologies to out soldiers. We have, documented evidence about how military officers were using like Jacked and other kinds of apps to try to get gay soldiers to give them information to out other soldiers. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but it seems to have had this kind of, again, like starts out as like a military import from the US, but not necessarily used that widely, and then remarkably used more frequently later after the 90s, and has become a huge issue with the Christian backlash against the LGBT movement, where soldiers, even when they're not on base in their barracks, like if you're a gay soldier and you have R&R and you go to, let's say you're in somewhere in the countryside and you come to Seoul where your boyfriend is, and you go to a hotel and you have sex with your boyfriend, when you're off base, that's a crime, officially. So they've used that law, it seems, quite randomly. And it's also not clear because the law doesn't say male-male sex. It says, it uses the word kegan, which is a really old word that's a holdover from Qing Dynasty penal codes, which basically means chicken sex. It basically means sodomy. It's also not clear, we know that straight people have anal sex. So it's not clear whether, like, a heterosexual soldier who, enjoys anal sex with a girlfriend who wears a strap-on, like, is that subject to the law as well? So it seems to have been used quite randomly, and more recently seems to have been targeting these kind of more equal relationships within the military, which are somehow seen as, I don't know, a disturbance.
We'll have a
Thank you.
last question. Thank you. We will have a last question from Elisa, and we will end.
Thank you, Youngmi. I was just wondering, you've been talking about being criminalized and said like defined as deviant and also linked to pro-communist. And so I was wondering if you were able to find any documentation on North Korea, then would they criminalize and also negatively define queers? Like, do you have any data on that? Were you able to find any?
From North Korea?
Yes.
It's hard to know. I cited in Queer Korea in the introduction, there's a footnote where I talk about what I could find about that. There's kind of conflicting evidence. There's some anecdotal evidence that it is criminalized. Just as in South Korea, it's used as a way of, and increasingly today, I should mention, the ultra fundamentalists have coined this term, like the pro-North Korean gay person, somehow linking being gay with being pro-North Korean. On the North Korean side, homosexuality is often described as like the thing that Americans brought to South Korea, or there are like certain politicians or certain people who indulge in homosexuality, and there's this notion of North Korean like heterosexual purity that I found in the case of North Korea. And I should say that there's a North Korean defector who came out as gay, and he wrote an autobiography. It's called 붉은 necktie, red necktie. And I've heard that it's being translated into English. If you're interested in him, you could Google it. There was recently an article about him, about how he fell in love with a Korean American. I think he's since moved to the United States. So the best information I think we have is through defectors, but in archives, it's been kind of hard to find. I did look a little bit at the Nodong Shinmun, the North Korean Workers' Party newspaper, and found some cases and instances, but it's a lot of speculation.
Thank you.
but it will be fascinating to know.
Thank you. That's such a fascinating talk, and really interesting questions from the audience. We've had distinct lecture series. I think we had 8 distinct lecture series this semester, and this week is the last one.
Oh,
So
wow.
after this, we will have a bit of research break. We have some discussion going on with whether we should do screening film, Korean film screening session. But if we have it, we'll come back to you. And Professor Henry, I mean, that would be great if we could invite you again when we have a conference in Edinburgh, so we could meet in person. That was really great. Thank you all. And I should say special thanks to Sang-pyo and Yejin and Jennifer, our organizing team for this academic event. Probably after we finish, we can have a brief meeting. But the seminar we can end now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Henry.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I knew